So then I went, well, how the hell do we do this? And what I began to do was I began to lay out something that seems very schematic, very cerebral. This is part of the problem here, is that this will feel cerebral to you. And that's frightening to actors because you have been told not to think. Right? I mean, I'm not saying literally, but in the ether, in this culture, around acting, emotion is king, and thinking is being in your head. Well, I'm sorry. It's very hard to act without your head. Okay, the one thing I would ask you all to do, relevant to what else you take away from this, never use that phrase. Use the phrase self-conscious, because that's what they're describing. But how it's often interpreted subconsciously is, I shouldn't think, I should just feel. Well, I have come to the conclusion that if, as the actor, you truly understand the moment-to-moment movement through the experience that your character is having, if you truly understand it, which I think is a visceral connection, it's a body sensation, and it's also an intellectual understanding. And you are actually in the moment when you work, and it is an emotion that you yourself are familiar with and somewhat comfortable with. There is absolutely no reason why that emotion won't arrive all on its own if you're playing the scene in the way that you understand the scene. Okay? So, I then said, okay, how do we do this? If it's about being in the moment, how do we make this work? And how I did it was I went, okay, let's try and work out what it is that makes one moment move to the next. Because if you understand why you say the second thing after you've just said the first thing, if it's a monologue, okay, if you understand that, why do you have to drill it? Because what I was trying to move people away from was a need to drill their lines, because I felt that that was a killer. I know that people often argue that if you drill them to the point where you don't have to think about them anymore, you then reach this state of freedom. Have you ever, just curious, have you ever really, really got to the point where you have completely and utterly let go of the fear that you might forget what you have to say? No. It may have happened one or two times, but most of the time that little niggly fear is still there in the core of your being, right? So I'm saying to you, embrace that fear and find a different way to work. That doesn't mean that you're trying to stop that fear by drilling it to the point where you have freedom, because I don't think that state really exists. And what I do know is that if you drill and drill and drill to try and get to that state, you're often deadening your relationship to what you are saying. And it's fascinating, isn't it, is that people don't do it in relationship to physical actions. You don't see people in the dressing room, unless it's fight choreography, which I'll talk about in a second. You don't see people in the dressing room running their blocking. You see them running their lines. Because they feel like you can adjust the blocking, but the lines it's a tighter experience, isn't it? Your experience with it is tighter. So part of what I'm trying to do is loosen up that experience. It's actually very similar to fight choreography. How do you, when you're doing a fight, how do you work out the fight? What's the one thing a fight choreographer will never allow you to do? They will never allow you to play the emotion of the scene until you have it so in your body that the emotion will not overcome your understanding of what you're doing, right? Okay. How do they create a fight in fight choreography? They create it moment by moment. And you work out this moment, and you work out how this moment moves to this moment, and then how this moment moves to this moment, and then this. And it's a series of moments. Only when all of those moments are understood by both people, by Ken and I, if we're in a fight scene together, only when we completely understand that, do we then let the emotion of the scene come into play. Working this way with text is almost identical to that experience. And what's the interesting thing of once you understand the moment-to-moment of movement of the fight, and you understand what the dynamic is between you and the other person, do you have to work to get the emotion? How many of you have been in a good, strong fight scene? Okay, when you've been in it, any of you, have you ever, once you've got all of the building blocks together and you let go, have you ever had to go, okay, so how am I going to feel what I'm supposed to feel in this fight? Have you ever asked yourself that? You might have asked yourself the question once when you were looking at how you think your character is responding inside the fight. But while you're having the fight, you're not having those thoughts, are you? And yet the emotion is there, isn't it? That's what I mean about the relationship of understanding to emotion.